Welcome everybody to this book chat that we're doing here at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. My name's Jovan Maud, I'm an editor here at the Institute, and today we're discussing this book, Monks, Money and Morality, The Balancing Act of Contemporary Buddhism, which has just been published by Bloomsbury and is the work of several current and former researchers here at the Institute. So today I'm talking to the three editors of the book, Christoph Brumann, who's head of research in the Department of Resilience and Transformation in Eurasia, as well as Saskia Abrahms-Kavunenko, who is a Marie Curie Fellow of Buddhist Studies at Copenhagen University, although she was formerly a postdoc here at the Institute, and another former postdoc, Beata Świtek, who is now an assistant professor of Japanese studies in Copenhagen University as well. So they're beaming in to us from Copenhagen. So welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
This is an edited collection which is investigating the economic side of contemporary Buddhism, particularly the sort of material relations that exist between Buddhist religious specialists and Buddhist lay people. It's made up of 11 case studies from various different Asian countries, from Sri Lanka through to Mongolia, China and Southeast Asia. So it's a very rich collection of studies. So maybe Christoph, I'll turn to you, and if you could tell me something about how this book came to be. You're the instigator of the project, so yes, how did this project emerge?
In a way, I am. Maybe not so much of the book, but rather of the research group we had here at the Max Planck Institute. Beata and Saskia were in it, but also two doctoral students whose chapters are, now they're PhD, well, they're postdocs, Christina Yonote and Hannah Kleppeis, whose chapters are also in the book. I think the initial impetus came from research I did in Kyoto in Japan. That was on a different topic, urban anthropology, but in that research I met quite a few Buddhist priests, and when they talked about their temples, they were mainly going on about practical sides, economic sides, how to keep the place running, how to keep it financed, yeah? Not so much about enlightenment or meditation and so on. And I thought, well, that's probably an interesting topic. And when I was invited to do a new research group here, I thought, let's explore that further. Also because conversations with colleagues like Patrice Latwig, who was here at the Institute at the time, confirmed to me that this is a topic that hasn't been looked at much. Buddhism somehow is above the clouds, yeah, and so spiritual that it's not economic. And I thought that can't be really true. Let's look into the matter a little more closely. And then, as is common when you have a research group here, we also thought it's good to have a conference and about it, invite others who are doing research about the same thing. And that's when Beata, Saskia and I organized the conference that finally led to this book.
Okay. So if I just turn to the other editors, maybe and ask you a little bit about your own contributions. So you both not only edited the book, but you had also chapters in it. So could you maybe tell me a little bit about how you came to the project? Beata.
So I specialize in Japan, being an anthropologist of Japan. So my contribution to the book is based on my research in Tokyo, primarily. And it's actually an interesting place to be and to look at what's happening in Buddhism, because you have a situation there whereby tax offices decide, what's religious, what's not, where you can purchase Buddhist rituals on Amazon, for example, for clearly defined price. So then the question was for me to look at, and this is what I write about in the chapter, is so how the Buddhist priests, as we refer to them in English in relation to Japan, how Buddhist priests deal with this situation where they can no longer talk about receiving donations, even linguistically, because the prices are set up out there. While some priests set prices, this approach does not sit well with everyone. And so I was looking at, in this chapter, I'm looking at what people do when they're trying to somehow negotiate this environment whereby you have prices, and at the same time you should be relying on donations.
Right, so turning to you, Saskia, would you like to tell us a little bit about your research in Mongolia?
So my chapter basically looks at this tension between degeneration and kind of rejuvenation, which you see a lot in Mongolia. So at the moment, since 1990, Mongolia was a socialist country from the 1920s to 1990. And in 1990, there was a democratic revolution. During the socialist period, especially since the late 1930s, people were not allowed to practice religion of any kind. And Buddhism was heavily persecuted, kind of reflecting the Stalinist purges as happened further north in Russia. So after the democratic revolution, people were able once again to rebuild temples. And so there was this big sense of rejuvenation, especially in the 1990s. But even though it's only been 30 years since that date, people are constantly discussing Buddhism as though it's in a state of decline, which I found really interesting. And this decline is often linked to monetary concerns. So people are very concerned about people accepting or asking for specific amounts of money. And in Mongolia, it's really common to go in and pay for prayers, which you do at a prayer shop where there's cash registers, and it's quite, at the busy times of year, which is often when people are going, the room is full of the sound of cash registers kind of, going off. So people are reacting to this sort of sense that maybe these monks are in it rather for the money than for sort of to assist people. And in Mongolia, there's this additional sense of that people shouldn't be motivated by basically generating benefit from the distress and ill sort of status of other people. So that money can be thought to be spiritually polluting in a sense as well. So there's also that tension.
Going over to you, Beata, I think that a lot of similar issues sort of came out in your research in Japan about how priests are also faced with this dilemma of whether they're economically motivated or practicing sort of authentic Buddhism.
What I found in Tokyo, in two different contexts on which I focused, is that the strategies that people deployed to deal with the situation were fairly similar. And in the chapter I present, I focus primarily on two cases, quite distinct cases. On one hand, I look at a fairly traditional temple that whose main activities revolve around the tradition-sanctioned practice or chanting Nembutsu, or the chanting of the name of Buddha Amida. And on the other hand, I introduced a Buddhist bar, which is possibly an outlet that is perhaps less readily associated with Buddhism. But nevertheless, despite the differences between these two outlets, in both cases, the priests responsible were relinquishing control over the direction in which the business was going in one case, or over any possible profits from the activities on the other, in the case of the temple. And I write about this as an act of withdrawing one's economic agency, an act that creates a new kind of economic transfer that has elements of both of donation and of economic exchange.
Okay. I wanted to ask about the core contribution that the collection is making. So Christoph, maybe you could say something about it. The subtitle of the book mentions a balancing act. So what is the nature of this balancing act that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think a core contribution, one contribution definitely show the diversity of economic engagements in Buddhism. As you said, there's chapters from all over the Buddhist heartland, Asia, and it's really different situations, but we find a common thread there. At least I think that there is one, with people being concerned about economic transactions, just the way Beata has just described it. It's crucially important to make a distinction between Buddhist economic transactions and everyday market transactions. A line must be drawn. We see that again and again. And it's quite surprising that it is such a huge concern for both lay people and clergy, because the Buddhisms we're looking at are quite distinct. Yeah, we have this rather loose Buddhism that you would find in Japan and Mongolia, where monks or priests marry and drink alcohol, etc., etc. And whereas there are also the forest monks in Sri Lanka, which are probably the strictest variety of Buddhism you can find anywhere, which lead a really ascetic life. But nonetheless, everyone's concerned about the proper use of money and economic resources, and to draw a line between what is, for example, a donation, what is a payment, etc. And that's not just on the monks or the religious specialists side, but also on the lay people's side. And we also see that lay people are kind of making this engagement with money a yardstick of the moral quality of the religious specialists. So it's really where you can test the quality of the Buddhism actually enacted by that religious specialist, the way they're dealing with money.
This is something that really reminds me of my own PhD research, which I did in southern Thailand on religious tourism. And I was talking to a lot of ethnic Chinese, Malaysians and Singaporeans who had travelled to Thailand and in search of monks to patronise. And they would often say to me that they thought the monks in Thailand were spiritually purer than the ones in Malaysia or Singapore, precisely because they didn't ask for a set price and payment for ritual services. The usual expression in Thailand is just to say, give according to your faith. Yeah, and so for them, this was very much a sign of ritual purity. But it seems to involve a paradox, because as soon as monks are deemed to be more pure, that actually means that they receive more and more donations and become richer and richer. So is this kind of what you might call the paradox of purity? Is that something you also find in other case studies in the book, Saskia?
Yeah, this is something that I found in my research as well, that people will be more comfortable, or a lot of people reported that they were more comfortable giving to these temples which didn't have set prayer prices. So there was a kind of, this feeling that if they could choose, even if that meant that they actually gave more, if they could choose to give, then they would be kind of giving to someone who themselves was more kind of, or at least the organization was more seen as being more pure and more morally kind of, on the right path morally, I would say. Yeah, but it's also something that we find in Buryatia and in many of the places that people are talking about in this book.
Beata, yeah.
Well, actually, in Japan, in some cases, having a set price is seen in more positive terms than asking for donation, because if you ask just for whatever you can give, people think, okay, I have to give that much. Whereas when a priest sets a price, it's seen, okay, so he is open about, or he or she is open about it, and they are being perceived as more trustworthy than other ways.
Saskia, would you like to add something there?
So I was recently talking to someone in Australia, a Thai Buddhist who's quite well known, and he also said that generally what happens is the novices will have time to meditate, and then the people who have been at the temple for longer end up spending most of their time in these kind of managerial positions, because they have to deal with the donations, they have to make sure that the structure of the temples is in place. So it's kind of also this double bind, I think, where the renunciates themselves sort of, because the more they renounce, as in, you see this in Prabhat Sirasina's chapter as well, the more that they renounce, the more money they get, and the more they have to manage the difficulties of getting the money. I mean, obviously there's difficulties with not receiving enough as well, which is at the other side of the story.
Beata?
Build on it and give the credit where it's due. The subtitle of the book actually comes from Prabhat Sirasina's chapter, where he discusses this very double bind that the forest monks find themselves in, because the more ascetic you are, the more donations you attract, and then while you are supposed to be detached from all these riches, you have goods piling up in the storage. So what do you do with that? And this is what he writes about in his chapter. This is where we took the subtitle from.
Okay, so then do you find that the monks use different strategies for sort of dealing with this problem?
Yes, there are, I guess, all kinds of strategies. You have this, well, put it to use for the Sangha, the community of religious specialists. That's what it's often meant to be. But then also like circumvention strategies. For example, again, it's about the forest monks in Sri Lanka, which know they can't redistribute it to needy lay people because that's against the Buddhist rules. But they can give their access to other temples, and including temples which they know practice charity. So that's a kind of way to work around the strict Buddhist rules that forbid to return to lay people what has been given to religious specialists. And so that's one way of dealing with it. But there are other ways too, like in several of the chapters also. For example, Alexander Hossmann's chapter on the Kuba, these Buddhist saints in the mountains of mountain regions of Thailand, they are engaging in charity, which is also called socially engaged Buddhism, and also exists in other places. There, this let's say this taboo against redistributing access to the laity is not apparently as strict, and so what they're doing is building hospitals, but also like building new temples, etc. So that's a way to deal with it.
Okay, so when you talk about something like charity, you know, a lot of people might be surprised that, say, Buddhists doing charitable acts might be considered by some Buddhists to be problematic or not possible. So this raises an interesting point, I think, when you talk about charity, that for a lot of people, they might find that that it's taken, like if you're thinking about Christianity, it's a very sort of taken for granted thing that charity is a sort of a part of Christian action. And yet in some Buddhist contexts, like the Sri Lankan case that you talked about, this seems to be somehow problematic. So in Buddhist studies, you know, there's a long-standing sort of model of the relationship between the religious specialists and the laity, which says that they're in a bilateral relationship in which the laity support the religious specialists materially, and the religious specialists, the monks or the lamas or the priests, support the laity in spiritual terms. And so it's through this bilateral sort of model that you get this problem of what happens when material things should sort of flow back towards the laity. So this has been a long-standing sort of debate within Buddhist studies, and I think your book makes a sort of an interesting contribution in various ways to that debate. So do you want to elaborate on that, Beata?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. And one of the contributions that I think speak most directly to what you just asked about is a chapter by Christina Yonote, who worked in Buryatia in Russia. She basically shows in her field site the differentiation, the bilateral differentiation between the Sangha and the laity did not actually make all that much sense, because what people were doing there, they were rather acting as one group, not transferring resources from one group to the other, but pulling these resources together towards one project. So Christina shows that rather than thinking of Sangha and the laity as two separate entities that exchange, that are involved in this in economic exchanges, it is better to think of them as one group that works towards one goal of and pulls resources together in order to revitalize Buddhism in Buryatia.
There's also another contribution in the volume by Martin Mills about Tibetan Buddhism in Ladakh, which is northern India, which I think raises these issues in a very interesting way, because what he observes there is a particular ritual being conducted. And he basically says, okay, the laity gives to the monks, and in order to conduct that ritual, but it's not really bilateral. It's they're a team, they're a unit. They're pooling. Well, he doesn't use pooling, that's Christina, but he says there's not really a transfer in the first place, because there's just one entity of monks and laity who together conduct a ritual and who together address the deity to which this particular ritual is directed. And I think that's also an interesting take, because a lot of the time I think that's actually what happens, that the bilateral relationship isn't really there, but they're working together as one unit, as one entity that kind of addresses the Buddhist deities.
Okay, so here the Sangha and the laity are conceptualized as a kind of a joint ritual actor.
A joint venture, yes.
Right, okay, Saskia, did you want to add something there?
I think it's really interesting how charity and capitalism are both two themes that also come out in the book. So this idea, illustrating in a way that how global forms of Buddhism have actually changed over time. So all of these case studies interacting with outside forces, whether that be state forces or international donors, or people also move a lot within Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism. You often see people going on pilgrimages to other places, and these being funded by global organizations. So there's also this kind of international element coming through in these case studies. Also within China, within the Tibetan regions of China or the Thai regions of China, you have the nation state being quite a powerful force. Also remembering that this is pre-2017, so things have also changed quite a lot for ethnic minorities in the last few years in China. The point is really that people are engaging so many different forces to do with this kind of around these questions of money. So we've got, different types of donors, different state actors. Some of the people have to pay, in my field site, for instance, Mongolian lamas have to pay taxes. So there's a lot of different pressures on people that change region to region, which is so interesting to get these comparisons.
You talk about various different sort of global forces, and that brings me to one question I wanted to ask about the book is, why did you decide only to focus on Asian contexts? As we know, there are a lot of Buddhists in the West these days, very much either in migrant communities or so-called convert communities. So was that a conscious decision only to focus on Asia?
Yes, it was. Because we thought that all these societies we're studying actually have a long tradition of Buddhism. It may have been disrupted by socialism, etc., persecution, but you could say that whatever in everyday morality, or the dominant everyday morality of people is religious, comes mainly from Buddhism. So in a way that's more interesting, or that we thought would be more instructive for understanding Buddhist morality than places where Buddhism is a minority, as it would be in the West, and where Buddhist morality also probably must react to the dominant moralities and their religious elements, which in the West often would be a Christian morality, in other places would be something different. But anyway, that's then, let's say, more of an epiphenomenon in a way than it would be in the places where Buddhism has deep roots and and an important societal standing.
That also brings me to another, what you might call omission from the book that you also discuss in the introduction, that there were no chapters that focused specifically on female renunciates, and I was wondering if you had focused on female renunciates, would perhaps different insights have come out of the book?
So yeah, one of the things that we do address in the beginning was that we were unfortunately unable to include any stories about female renunciates or female religious specialists, which is a real shame for the book. We did have some presenters in the initial conference who did look at those issues, but they were unfortunately unable to contribute. I think it would have given us a different angle, especially I'm sort of more familiar, I guess, with Vajrayana Buddhism. And in Vajrayana Buddhism, as well as Theravada actually, female renunciates tend to be sort of given less things, given less donations, and this creates a real problem for them to sort of, just subsist as in their sort of religious vocations. And I think it would have been really excellent to have those stories as well.
So the book is very much about the sort of dilemmas that a religious tradition faces when it comes to issues of money and exchange and incorporation into the capitalist economy. So I can see why these would be very interesting to scholars of contemporary Buddhism. Would you say, though, that the book makes a contribution beyond just Buddhist studies per se, into economic anthropology more generally? So, for example, a key discussion goes back to Marcel Maus's notion of the gift and whether the gift always creates social relationships, whether it always is bound to the obligation to reciprocate. And yet, a lot of the Buddhist context, the concept of dana, which entails a sort of a notion of selfless giving, seems to challenge that model. So does this collection make a new contribution to, say, the notion of the gift?
I don't think we reinvent economic anthropology in the collection. I wouldn't be claiming that much, but what we show is that it's often quite difficult to place. It has Buddhist transactions, economic transactions can have a number of aspects simultaneously, where there's the bilateral relationship, which is might have a calculative element to a certain extent. So it's from gratitude, but also from expectation of preferential treatment that you give to the religious specialist. But it's not just that. You at the same time still think it's something altruistic where you don't expect a return. And you know that you shouldn't expect a concrete return. And then at the same time, there's also the idea, irrespective of what we are doing with, like Hannah Kleppeis in her chapter on Tibetan Buddhism in China also brings that out, irrespective of whether the recipient really is worth being awarded with money, being given money, like maybe a bad monk or so, but irrespective of that, I'm making a contribution to a larger project in which we all have a stake, and that is the upkeep, the maintenance of Buddhism, as a religious tradition. I think the fact that all these considerations co-occur, exist in people's minds at the same time, is a really important one that probably needs to be addressed more in future anthropological studies of Buddhism.
Asking the question about the future. So now that this book is out in the world, do you feel like there are particular questions that still need to be addressed in this area?
Beata and I are about to embark, starting this year in September, on a new project which is looking at basically the endpoints of these sort of economic considerations, which is excess and waste and consumption. So kind of like turning the attention more towards the materiality of these relationships. And there's a new project starting in Copenhagen at the Center for Contemporary Buddhist Studies called Waste, Consumption and Buddhism in the Age of Garbage. And that's something that we'll be working on. But I think there's a myriad of ways that new scholars can come at this question, or the things that might sort of flow on from this attention to, these tensions that we've talked about and seen in the book.
Okay, so that sounds really fascinating to talk about the relationship between Buddhism and waste. Can you give me an example of the sorts of things you're looking at?
In my project that I will be pursuing under this umbrella of the larger research theme is looking at the food donations and what's happening with food after it's been donated, either or placed on the altar or whatever. So how is it being discarded? Does it become trash? Is it being passed on? And through which channels? Why? And what does it all mean?
So I'm going to be looking at how also the kind of materiality of items stays on beyond after they have been kind of used and discarded. So in particular, kind of like polyester prayer scarves, how are they, when they're left at ritual sites, how are they dealt with? Because they don't decompose. But yet you can't just throw them in the bin. So there's a kind of ambivalence between these material objects as they're sort of, post kind of their ritual use, which is very, very interesting as well. And part of the economic kind of aspects of things will flow into that project as well.
Christoph.
As to my personal future research, I did actually more field research after the book, after we finished the book in Kyoto. And what I found interesting, Kyoto is the center of Japanese Buddhism. I didn't concentrate on the big and famous ones, but rather on small family-run temples. And I found it interesting, particularly in 2 temples, how much time and energy was invested into thinking about the future of the temple. So it's no longer the expectation that Buddhism and the temples will simply run on, but that you have to do something consciously to make it meaningful for future society. And that now's the time to think about these matters, discuss them with parishioners, like the people that regularly come to the temple, and so on. So that's something I personally would like to continue. In general, I think there's a lot of topics in the book I think that deserve further attention. I still think it's an understudied topic in Buddhist studies, and because as we see again and again in the chapters, basically people take it as a yardstick, really a testing ground for the quality of the Buddhist commitment, the way how money, how other economic resources are being treated. And I think that should be given due attention.
All right, so I'm wrapping up now. I'd just like to thank the 3 of you for joining me today. Christoph, thank you very much. Saskia and Beata, it's been a great discussion. Thank you.